The mud is deep. It is the color of dried rust, churned into slurry by 10,000 sandaled feet, by the bodies dragged across it, by men dying face first into it. Somewhere beyond the chaos, beyond the screaming, beyond the crash of bronze on bronze, beyond the terrible groan of a formation caving in on itself, a Spartan king is on his knees. Not in surrender. Never in surrender. Agis III of Sparta, ruler of one of the city's two ancient royal bloodlines, has been cut down by the Macedonians under Antipater's command, a force nearly twice the size of everything he brought to the field. The wounds the ancient record describes are frontal, the kind a man collects when he never once stopped facing his enemies. His soldiers are trying to pull him off the field. He orders them to stop. He reaches for a weapon, and there, rising slowly, painfully, in the shadow of Megalopolis, Agis III lifts himself from the ground. Sit with that image for a moment. The man leading the last credible Spartan challenge to Macedonian power, surrounded, unable to stand, and yet he rises to his knees, raises his weapon, and faces them anyway. He kills several of the soldiers, closing in before a javelin, thrown with merciless accuracy, finally ends him. Diodorus of Sicily, writing centuries after the fact, kept the account spare and almost reverent. Agis armed himself, rose to his knees, cut down several enemies, and was himself killed by a thrown spear. Simple words, a devastating image. And when Alexander the Great, thousands of miles away deep in the Persian interior, finally heard about the battle, about the thousands of dead on both sides, about the king who literally bled out fighting from the ground for the liberty of his people, do you know what he called it? A battle of mice. That is the story we're telling today. How a Spartan king bet everything on one desperate gamble against the most powerful military apparatus of his era. How close he came to actually winning, and how, in the end, the man he was fighting went out of his way to erase him with 2 words. I've returned to this story many times, and I still haven't settled whether it stands as the most defiant moment in Spartan history or its most heartbreaking act of futility. Maybe it's both. Maybe that tension is the entire point. When Agis III took the Spartan throne in 338 BC, he stepped into a city that was already cracking at the foundation. That same year, the very same year, Philip II of Macedon crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea, and with one afternoon of violence, classical Greece as the world had known it ceased to exist. The city-states that had defined Western civilization for centuries, proud, combative, fiercely self-governing, were herded into Philip's Corinthian League, a political enclosure dressed up in the language of alliance. Sparta, characteristically, refused to join, and was just as pointedly excluded as it excluded itself. Its military reputation still carried enough weight that Philip chose not to press the issue. That choice, allowing Sparta to sit in its proud, festering isolation, would produce consequences nobody had anticipated. Agis watched from the inside. He saw what his city had become. Once the name alone had been enough to silence entire assemblies of men, now Sparta sat in the margins, while others drew the map of Greece. The humiliation was real, and it was daily, and Agis was not a man who was wired for humiliation. He came from the Eurypontid royal line, one of Sparta's 2 dynastic houses. His father, Archidamus III, had died fighting in Italy. The crown passed to Agis, already soaked in loss, and from the earliest days of his reign he set himself on a collision course with the new order of things. Here is where the story becomes genuinely compelling, because Agis did not simply lash out from wounded pride. He identified a strategic opening, and he moved through it with a calculated intelligence that rarely receives the recognition it deserves. Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC. His son Alexander, barely 20 years old, took power, secured his throne, subdued Greece and the northern borders, and crossed into Asia in 334 BC, taking the finest edge of Macedonia's professional military with him. What he left behind in Greece was his regent, Antipater, capable and experienced, but stretched dangerously thin. The Macedonian grip on Greece remained real, but its enforcement arm had just sailed east. Looking at the strategic picture in 333 BC, Agis's plan doesn't look reckless at all. It looks almost shrewd. In the late spring of that year, the Persian admiral Pharnabazus, desperate to pry open a second front against Alexander, approached Agis with ships and silver. Agis accepted. That was the seed of everything that followed. Then, critically, after Alexander shattered the Persian force at the Battle of Issus later that same year, roughly 8,000 Greek mercenaries who had been fighting under Darius III found themselves adrift, leaderless, paymasterless, and burning for a way to strike back at the power that had just routed them. Agis recruited them on the spot. Think about what that actually meant. In the winter of 333 to 332 BC, Agis suddenly had 8,000 battle-hardened professionals who had just survived a major engagement against Alexander's machine, who had faced the Macedonian Sarissa phalanx from the receiving end and lived, and who had every reason in the world to want a second round. He now had a core fighting force. He had Persian money. He had a plan. Agis did not stop at mercenaries. He moved across the political chessboard with remarkable energy and sophistication. He sailed to Crete first. The island sat at the strategic center of the eastern Mediterranean, with substantial military resources and enormous leverage over Aegean sea lanes. Agis reorganized the island's internal affairs, brought most of its cities into the anti-Macedonian orbit, and recruited additional soldiers. This maneuver forced Alexander to redirect naval assets to the Aegean men and ships he could not spare to counter Agis's growing influence. It was a disciplined strategic pressure campaign, not simply a regional uprising. Back on the Greek mainland, Agis assembled a coalition that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The city-state of Elis joined him. Nearly all the Achaean cities of the northern Peloponnese joined him. Most of the Arcadian towns followed. This was not a Spartan revolt. This was a Peloponnesian uprising, a genuine structured challenge to Macedonian authority in the geographic heart of Greece itself. The exceptions were painful ones. Megalopolis, sitting in the middle of Arcadia, had been founded specifically to check Spartan expansion. It was anti-Spartan by design and by history, and it refused. Athens, the great self-proclaimed champion of Greek liberty, the city whose orators had never stopped invoking freedom as a rallying cry, also declined. They offered excuses. They accepted a calculated gift from Alexander, the release of Athenian prisoners, timed perfectly to keep the city pacified and on the sideline. Personally, I find this one of the most damning episodes in Athenian political history. And Demosthenes, the great rhetorician who had spent his entire public life thundering against Macedonian dominance, did almost nothing to support the one king who actually raised an army and marched. That silence carries a particular ugliness that history has been too generous in overlooking. Agis did not hold out for a perfect moment. He struck when the moment was good enough. Around 331 BC, with Antipater pinned down by a rebellion in Thrace to the north, Agis moved his coalition force into action. He defeated a Macedonian commander named Agis in open battle. Not a skirmish or a raid, but a direct military defeat of a Macedonian officer in the field. The kind of result that tells every fence-sitting Greek city which direction the wind might actually be turning. Fresh from that victory, Agis laid siege to Megalopolis itself, the great anti-Spartan city at the heart of Arcadia, the one that had refused him. If he could take it, he controlled the central Peloponnese, and if he held the region long enough, Antipater's distraction in the north could become a permanent crisis rather than a temporary one. The siege dragged on. Megalopolis held. Then the news arrived that would change everything. Antipater had made terms with the Thracian rebels. He was free, and he was marching south with everything he could gather. The scale of Antipater's response was itself a message. He marched south with no fewer than 40,000 men, according to Diodorus. Macedonian veterans, Greek allied contingents from loyalist cities, Thessalian cavalry, and soldiers released from the northern campaign. A composite army assembled quickly and backed by 3,000 talents of silver sent west by Alexander to fund the suppression. This was not a punitive expedition. It was a deliberate, fully resourced military operation designed to end the Spartan problem permanently. Agis commanded somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 men in total, infantry, cavalry, and allied contingents combined. Roughly half his infantry, around 10,000, were the battle-tested mercenaries who had survived Agis. These were not green conscripts. They were professionals who had stood in the Persian line against Alexander himself, who understood Macedonian tactics from brutal first-hand experience. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1. He knew it, and unlike a man who has simply stopped calculating, he responded with the cold composure of a serious commander. He chose his ground. When Antipater's massive column marched south into the Peloponnese, Agis lifted the siege of Megalopolis. He could not absorb a strike from two directions at once. He withdrew south, scouting terrain, looking for the place where the numbers equation could be partially rewritten. He found a constricted position near Megalopolis, narrow enough to compress Antipater's broader front, tight enough to force the Macedonians to fight something closer to an even contest. He would hold a bottleneck, like Leonidas at Thermopylae, and he would make Antipater pay for every inch of ground. When you understand the tactical thinking behind that decision, it completely transforms how you see Agis III. This is not the story of a proud fool who charged blindly into an army twice his size, because Spartans famously don't know how to count. This is the story of a skilled commander extracting every possible advantage from a hand that was stacked against him. playing it as well as it could conceivably be played. Two armies rolling toward each other across the Peloponnese in the autumn of 331 BC. On the Macedonian side, the Sarissa phalanx, the weapon system that had redefined Greek warfare under Philip II. The Sarissa was an 18-foot pike. A formation armed with it presented not one row of spear points but 5 overlapping rows simultaneously, a bristling wall of iron tips that reached an enemy well before any shorter weapon could answer. Against the traditional hoplite formation, the Sarissa was, in honest terms, a killing machine. The Spartans knew this. They had known it since Chaeronea. They came anyway. On the Spartan side, citizen warriors trained since childhood for exactly this. The round hoplon shield, nearly 30 inches across, dense wood and bronze, heavy enough to cave a man's chest when driven forward at a full advance pace. The 8-foot doru spear, and behind the front ranks, the weight of an entire formation pressing forward, because a phalanx is not a collection of individual fighters. It is a collective instrument of pressure, a grinding machine.